Good morning, everybody. I hope you are all glad to be in here in air condition, because this will be one of the most hot days throughout the year in California. Nothing against California. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm the director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all for the beginning of this exciting conference, which brings together a lot of different disciplines. And this is what the agenda of the research center I'm heading is all about, is to really trying to make the intersection of different disciplines productive. And one of our main agendas is digital genocide studies. And so I'm especially excited to have renowned scholars from all over the world here today. I want to say special thanks to our co-sponsor, the Digital Melon Program for Humanities here at USC, who kind of helped to make the conference happen and is responsible for bringing a lot of people from other continents here to the conference. So I'm just, before we start, I want to hand over to Stephen Smith, the Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation, just for a brief welcome.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Stephen Smith, Executive Director of USC Shoah Foundation. This is all about collaboration. Wolf just mentioned a moment ago that our co-sponsor is part of a grant that we've had from the Mellon Foundation to explore digital humanities here at USC, which has helped to bring us, convene us together. And I want to thank our Vice Dean Peter Mancall in his absence, who I hope is at the Huntington Library writing during his sabbatical while we all deliberate. And to Wolf Gruner, who's just amazing director of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, ensuring that we are all here and working together and collaborating on so many levels. I'm very confident that what will come out of this is not only the brilliance of your papers and the amazing discussions that we will have together, but further collaboration. And I would want to say, just on behalf of the USC Shoah Foundation, we really, really welcome that. I'm already looking around the room and seeing that, with Paul and Anna and Giordano and others that came 3 years ago for the first time to look at the Holocaust Geographies Research Week, which stimulated further discussion about how we convene in the digital humanities, continue to convene in the digital humanities around the archive of the USC Shoah Foundation. But this is obviously not about the USC Shoah Foundation. We're one source among many, many, using some technologies and thinking about what new technologies will emerge that impact all of our work. It's amazing to think that we come from so many disciplines. Just as a note of caution, I'm a theologian by training, and I'm going to present on technology this afternoon. This is what's happening in our field, that we're having to adapt and develop and think about what it means to live in a world in which these opportunities now emerge for us to explore deeply in the digital world and to think about its complexity. Thank you for being willing to do that this next couple of days. Thank you for what I anticipate will be a really rich discussion. And I'm going to hand it back to Wolf to chair our conference. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So I just wanted to give you a kind of a heads up about the format. In difference to other conferences, we discuss every presentation individually because we want to really emphasize the discussion of the topics, and we also have a lot of space and room for and time for discussion, which means we can come back to topics we may discuss this morning, maybe tomorrow afternoon, just to kind of pick up things we had kind of explored a little bit, and maybe we want to go deeper. And I think this is the format we kind of applied here, and I hope this will kind of really produce some very interesting debates. So now I'm asking Lynn Boyd-Judson to come forward. She's the chair of this first introductory panel, which is also a little bit different because what we tried to do here is we asked Todd, Presner and Alina, Bothe to give some more general remarks to kind of give us a little bit of a frame for the whole conference before we go into details, methodological questions and so on. So so I hand over to Lynn.
May I call our panel up?
Yeah.
Is that appropriate? Good morning, everyone. Would you all come? Todd? Is this Todd here? I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you yet. I'm Dr. Boyd-Judson. Welcome, welcome. Come on up. I'll introduce the two of you. My name is Lynn Boyd-Judson, and I'm director of the USC Levin Institute here for Humanities and Ethics. I'm also a member of the Shoah Foundation Institute Advisory Board, a proud member. It's a wonderful work that Wolf and Stephen are doing through this organization. I'm also executive director of the Oxford Consortium for Human Rights. And in the context of today's full day of fascinating talks, I have the pleasure of presiding over a panel with Todd Presner and Alina Bothe. Following Wolf's very specific guidelines on how we run this panel, I will begin by introducing Professor Todd Presner. Todd Presner is Professor of Germanic Languages, Comparative Literature, and Jewish Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Since 2011, he is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Director of the UCLA Alina Center for Jewish Studies. He is also the chair of the Digital Humanities Program and faculty co-PI on the Urban Humanities Initiative at UCLA. His research focuses on European intellectual history, visual culture, digital humanities, and cultural geography. His latest book in a long list is titled Probing the Ethics of Holocaust Culture, published by Harvard University Press in 2016, and co-edited with Wolf Kunsteiner and Claudio Fogu. His current research project is called The Ethics of the Algorithm, and examines the nexus and tension between computation and ethics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Presner.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for the kind introduction. I'm really quite honored to lead off this conference and hope that the introductory general remarks will have some profundity. But in any case, maybe they'll provide a framework that we can work within over the next couple of days. I was asked to talk about some of the challenges and really possibilities of bringing the two fields of digital humanities and Holocaust studies together. And I'll do that through a series of examples and also try to problematize and think through some ideas of where the field may go. Let me grab my water real quick. I'm going to start with some acknowledgements because some of you will see yourself in things that I'm going to show. And I do want to call out Anne, who's been a dear friend and colleague for many years, most recently in a conversation that we had at the University of Maine, and members of the Geography of the Holocaust team. You're going to have some of your slides reproduced here. I hope that's okay. It's an admiration of the work that you've done. And particularly as well, I've worked for a number of years with the Visual History Archive, and I do want to thank Stephen Smith, Sam Gusman, and really all the staff at the VHA for the willingness to share so much material and metadata from the archive with me. So where to begin? Certainly, the sheer range of digital archives regarding the Holocaust is something that I think already, in terms of size, begins to raise a number of questions, some of which have to do with scale, some of which have to do with possibilities for search and query, some of which have to do with questions of how do we visualize, what kind of questions can be asked of the archive. And of course, the very idea of what kind of question can be asked is also a function of what state it's in and what has been what has been made digitally tractable, meaning something that a computer can do something with. So certainly we know now that many of the ITS archives are coming online. Most of them look like that, which are largely flat files that you can't get inside of. And so the material that's contained in the artifact is really not digitally tractable. We know, of course, we can search for victim names through the Yad Vashem's database, and of course, we're very familiar with the basic interface, which of course is now changing dramatically, of the material that's in the Visual History Archive. One of the things that I would say that's in common of all these things is the search box, and I'd like us to think a little bit about that because the search box already is a kind of epistemology of what we can know, what we can find out, and what we can retrieve. And one of the challenges that I see, and I'll get to this at the end, is going beyond the search box for different kinds of interactivity and different modes of discoverability, especially from complex archives. So you see in all these examples empty little search boxes there. Now, another challenge with digital material, of course, has been the fact that it's always being mediated and remediated. And, look over here. we know that you could have Pinchas Guter over here. He can be reproduced here. He's behind a green screen. He has his testimony that was recorded on tape, on 30-minute tapes that have been really transmediated into a digital environment and finally into a further digital environment. And he's not just, of course, his embodied representation, he's also the information system around it. So all the tagging, all of the material that have allowed us to query and ask him questions and to get answers based on his testimony. Now, of course, questions around mediation go back really to the very beginnings of Holocaust testimony. This is David Bothe on the wire recorder. He goes to DP camps in 1946 and 1947, records testimonies, and interestingly enough, comes up with an ontology for marking up testimonies. An ontology that's really quite amazing to develop in 1947-48 because his focus is specifically on quantifying trauma. And so how one quantifies trauma and develops an ontology for doing that is something that, of course, is really a challenge that the Shoah Foundation and others are still, I think, grappling with. All these, they're now, of course, remediated in multiple environments, so from the wire recorder to the digital environment. And what you see on the bottom here is a memorial. This is another way of thinking about mediation and remediation. This is a memorial to the 100,000 Dutch Jews that were killed during the Holocaust, and this is version 1.0 of it. It no longer exists. Its dates were 2005 to 2016. But what you see here is a pixelated, or really not pixelated, it's a raster bitmap representing 100,000 people who were killed. Each individual square represents a person, and all together you get this really this complex digital image. Now, there's some interesting questions that are raised here. One, of course, is what does it mean to represent atrocity or death in this manner. So by picking these little blue bars or green bars or yellow or pink, depending on who's being represented. But it's not only just a question of the interface, and the interface is just one aspect. It's also the data that generates the interface. So it's the database that runs behind it. So if one clicks on an object, one gets data, and the data, of course, is in a structured format, allowing it to be queried. And so this is a particular family, Nathan de Hond and his family, all of whom were killed in Auschwitz. There's some basic information that you can retrieve about them, and each one is represented as a series of pixels. Now, what I wrote over here is there's a number of different parts of it that are important to think about. One is the interface, which again is a kind of a raster graphic. One is, of course, the symbology. One, of course, is now the data and the database that's behind it and the functionality for doing queries. The other, and I think this is interesting because of a digital environment, is it's also databases are extensible and potentially exportable. The data can be shared with other people. You could develop a different interface. Doesn't have to be that one. Insofar as you develop a different interface, there might be different kinds of ways in which that material is being privileged or used. And I would just show you an example. This is the new interface that they developed since 2016. And so this is a names-based version. Now, of course, raises interesting questions. I mean, just right away, we think, okay, well, maybe pixels are abstractions. Maybe they're dehumanizing. Maybe the critique was we have to focus on names. It still has a similar functionality in terms of zoomability. This is, I think, a big aspect of how this memorial was imagined. You can zoom in and out of it to get a sense of scale, but ultimately it resolves itself into photos and pictures. And one of the things you see is as you zoom in, you see people. And this, of course, was a big critique of this memorial. A further critique was it's dematerialized. And so why would you need to build a physical memorial? Well, Daniel Liebeskind is designing one which will be very similar to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is an inscription of names. And so, again, a physical place rather than a digital environment. So all this is to say is that there's a number of anxieties over the digitization of the Holocaust, and I'm going to talk about what some of these anxieties might be and how we might want to confront them. Now, I know, and this is, I think, maybe a signal out to the paper we'll hear from Alina in a little bit, but whether the Holocaust represents some kind of limit or test case, that is to say, maybe there's a transgression that's happened, and maybe that transgression has to do something with what computational forms of representation or mediation or analysis can do. And many of us have been dancing on that, on this, if there is a border at all, and I don't personally think there is, but many people have expressed anxieties over what could be seen as the digitization of the Holocaust. And I think it makes sense to confront those anxieties and either to dispel them or to think through where do they come from. So what would be some of these anxieties? I'll enumerate them here. Anxieties about the Holocaust, because the digital as a term, and I'm collapsing a lot of things here, I realize, but it seems to partake perhaps, and this is maybe the strongest critique, in a kind of rationalization or abstraction of experience that maybe is the same structural logic that gave rise to the Holocaust itself. Right? The card systems, the census systems, the punching systems that were developed by IBM, all of these aspects have a history that speaks to abstraction and extreme rationalization, and is the computational somehow in that grip still? And this has always been my real question for that project that you mentioned, the ethics of the algorithm. Is there an ethical approach to algorithmic thinking that would get us beyond this binary? I'm not proposing this as a problem, I'm laying out what some of the anxieties are. One that's connected with this, and maybe it's a little bit less about saying that the Holocaust rationalization is the problem, but just saying, computational processes tend to turn everything into data, it's reductive, quantifiable processes, disambiguation. So much about what we're talking about is about ambiguity and about humanity. That's another critique. A further critique, maybe one that's not as strong, but still important, is that the digital is simply an unstable steward of memory. We need a physical memorial that's actually somewhere, rather than something that is fungible and changing all the time. That other memorial's not even around anymore. So its multimediality is not a good thing, it's actually a problem. My colleagues often tell me that the digital, we don't know how it works, so it's the black box. We don't know what's inside. You shake it up and something comes out. But in any case, by the fact that it's not fully knowable, also leads to the skepticism and anxiety, right? Another one that we see often is the loss of control, because, ultimately you put it out there on the web. It could be open to anyone, anywhere, anytime. The loss of control, right? This is another anxiety. And then I guess the one I hear perhaps most often from historian colleagues of mine is that it's ultimately it's reductive. We do serious interpretive, contextual work, archival work, we do narrative, and this is very reductive empiricism, and that there's some kind of opposition here. I don't, again, believe in this opposition. However, I'm pointing out that this is, again, the basis for many of these anxieties. So those would be some of the anxieties that I see around the digitization. Now, one way to think about this is to maybe look at what we might call, and again, I mean this kind of reductively, analog information systems, and I'm going to look at some examples of a book, and digital information systems might enable. And again, this is a little bit reductive, but I think it will make a point that could be useful. So, for example, we now have, and many of you have worked with this much more than I have, we have 4 amazing volumes that the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has created, volumes 1 and volumes 2 of the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. These are extraordinary books. If any of you have worked with them, you know how heavy they are. You know well, you can't check them out from the library without special permission, is what I found out. They're about, I don't know, they're over 1,000 pages in length, and the extraordinary comprehensive material, which is meant to enumerate every single camp and ghetto, but much more than that, transit camp, sub-camp, and so forth. And the way in which this information system works is largely it's organized on 3 levels. So you have a table of contents, which is alphabetical. You have 3 indices that you can work with. One is a names index, one is an organization and enterprise index, and one is a place index. And so if you want to find information or get information out of this, this is how you would do it. I'm interested in a particular camp. I can go to the table of contents and find out about Auschwitz I main camp. I can read the entry. The entry is extraordinarily, I'd say, factual in terms of what it provides. And and again, if I'm not exactly sure, I may be able to search by place or organization or something like that. Now, the question really is, and you can do a little bit more with the PDF, by the way, one of the things that you can do using this information system is you can do a basic search and find, again, using the structuring and query mechanisms that they provide. So this allows you to either go, via the contents or indices, or to browse the book, alphabetically. And if you go to the PDF, Acrobat, and this is not, this is just using Acrobat, it allows you to search by any word. I was interested in particularly homosexual victims, and although that's not in any of the indices, it turns out, they're mentioned about 15 times throughout the book, and yet it didn't give me what I needed to know, but it was a term that I couldn't have used without Acrobat. Now, if we go to sort of like the research questions to understand this, we realize that so many of the questions that they're interested in are really factual questions. When, what, who, where, and how. So it's like, who commanded the guard site? What type of prisoners were there? What companies did this? How many prisoners were there? What were the methods? What elements of the culture were unique? What were the key events? When did it happen? And so forth. Who were the perpetrators? What happened to them before and after the war? These kind of questions, again, are absolutely critical for foundational information. Absolutely critical. And if you look at one of the entries, what you see, and I'll just show you because I kind of started to try to extract some of the information out, I thought, looking at this text, there's a ton of information in here that to me would function as data if it was only queryable in different ways. And so what I find over here, and this is just me trying to extract from the first couple paragraphs information that I found there, you have information about the beginning, middle, and end of the camp and aftermath. You have change over time, so in terms of administration, prisoners. You have information about camp organization and hierarchies, types of prisoners. You have a lot of information on physical dimensions, which is really striking. I'm thinking of Paul's work on modeling. So number of buildings, size of buildings, change over time. You sometimes have contextual events. You sometimes have networks of associated other things like industries or labor facilities. You sometimes have interrelationship of Nazi programs and key concepts. You also have, and this is very interesting too, a recognition of uncertainty. And this is a key thing in the digital, is how to characterize uncertainty or ambiguity or unavailability of data. This is often recognized in these texts. And that's something that if you were to port them into a digital environment would also be important to come to terms with. And of course, you have a range of source material that this rests upon. Well, this has some advantages. It definitely intends to be authoritative and comprehensive, and I think it is. It's easy to search if I know what I want. Sorry, but I actually I appreciate that, because it's not easy to search if you don't know what you want, or if you're doing research questions that move beyond this kind of organizational structure. Now, the narrative organization is helpful. Again, I know exactly what I need to read up on. I need to read up on Dachau, and I do it. The problem is this. The data is locked up on the page, and each entry, and this is the real problem, is atomized. Insofar as it's atomized, you are not able to make correlations or comparisons across the different entries. And I began to think, I was like, okay, what if I just started to mark this up very basically? And this is make-believe, by the way. Don't reproduce this. I thought, okay, let me just take the first couple of paragraphs and let's stick it in. I'm going to do a very basic XML markup here. This is probably not TI compliant at all, because I just invented this. But my point here is that suddenly, as soon as I can begin to mark this up, there's a tremendous amount of data that I could do something with, right? I can talk about the establishment of the camp. I give it my dates. I can talk about time span. I can take, they reference Heinrich Himmler. I can, link it directly to their own article on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the particular role that he played. I can provide coordinates for where the camp was. So there's the coordinates, the latitude and longitude. I can provide, prisoner labels. I can provide prisoner types. There's a tremendous amount of information that if I start to mark this up, I could begin to do something with. But again, unless I do this markup and turn it into something that's computationally tractable, like XML, or eventually into a database, it's stuck only as this. It's locked down. This is an attempt to begin to unlock it. So what kind of research cannot be easily undertaken then is clearly something that's comparative, like diachronic or synchronic. I'm looking for every single moment on a particular date, June 30th, 1942. Can't do that. That would be a synchronic analysis, but it might be really interesting. Or I'm looking for change over time, or I'm looking for correlative studies, scaled analyses, meaning from micro to macro level, any kind of network analysis, as well as experimental studies, meaning like a what if. Now, if you look at the maps, and I mean, many of you are going to talk about GIS later, these maps are utterly not geographic information systems. They're essentially, hey Phil, they are essentially, they're flat files. Again, you can't do anything with them simply because they're no better than a diagram. And unfortunately, insofar as this material, again, is locked down, we have essentially a challenge. Now, of course, this is my call out to the Geographies of the Holocaust team. Much of this beginning work has been done already, and I'd say that some of the foundational work really came out in this book, which I think is extraordinary, to begin to develop a historical GIS. And I'll show you a couple of examples of some of their work. Many of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, I encourage you to look at it, because this in many ways is a response to the lockdownness of these type of encyclopedias. So this would be an example of diachronic and synchronic comparisons of opening and closing of camps and their subcamps. The black bars here give you the time, so you just look down. These are all of the major camps and the associated subcamps when they came. Now, why would you want to look at this? Well, again, if I'm interested in a particular time and I want to see the simultaneity of a policy and the way in which it was implemented, this would be a very helpful graphical analysis that would lead me to see, okay, this is relevant and this is not. It's not something that one could do without having a database and without having a visualization. Again, it can't do it from a narrative-based encyclopedia entry. One has to do something with that data. One either has to extract the data or mark up the data or put it into an information system that allows you to visualize it. And this, I think, is an interesting challenge that we still are facing. So, what can you do with digital information systems? Well, obviously, comparative analysis becomes very interesting. I'm interested in topography. I have topographical maps. I'm interested in processes. Maybe you're interested in correlation between disease and weather conditions. If you have a weather database and you're also interested in the outbreak of typhus, it might be that I can study that outbreak in a particular local or global context. What about the relationship between the evacuation of the camps and the advancement of the front lines? Really interesting, perhaps, especially when you're studying the death marches. But again, I can't do those kind of contextual studies unless I can bring in multiple data sets. The key here is extensible analyses and scaled analyses. And I would also say maybe network analyses that allow us to understand relationships or communities. I would further say that digital allows you to ask experimental speculative questions, kind of what if? Like what if something was the case? You can create models that could understand this, and you could also look maybe at one of my own research areas, kind of conceptual history, which is understanding the changing use of concepts over time. And that was something that was very striking where the prisoners are designated in particular ways. Protective custody. What did protective custody mean in 1933 versus 34? What did it mean? What does that rule? When did that term was it no longer used? And again, I need to have a much larger kind of synchronic analysis to make sense of it, and a diachronic one as well. A couple other examples. On the right here is from Paul Jaskut, and this is a model from Auschwitz. On the left is a colleague of mine at UCLA, Chris Johansson, who works on a modeling for something called Rome Lab. And what he's interested here are things that I think would be really interesting for this kind of work, and I think you are interested in. These are questions of sightlines. What can be seen, and from what perspective? Who can see? The privilege of sight, right? Of most of us, very few people, I don't think anyone, had a kind of bird's eye overview. You're embodied in an environment. And so what does it mean to be able to see and maneuver through an environment which is always shifting and changing? What does it mean to be able to hear? One of my own questions I've always been interested in is what can be heard and smelled outside the camp? And to understand these diffusion of smell, diffusion of sound, diffusion of sight, one needs to have models that are embodied. So this means embodied events. This also calls for, and this is very kind of like out in the air, but an approach to GIS which could be what might be called body-based GIS. So a coordinate system that's not necessarily based on latitude and longitude, but about relationships between bodies and communities. So really what could be heard and seen and perceived based on one's body, both the privilege and lack of privilege that certain people had. I think this is one of my last couple slides that I'll end up. So principles of digital information systems, I'd say structured data can be queried, organized by recognized metadata standards, interoperable, extensible, exportable, importable, recombinatory, and giving rise constantly to new sorts of digital content. I realize it's actually not my last slide, so I'm going to skip a couple, but I'll end in a second. Yeah, I'm going to skip this part. But let me just say that, unfortunately, I had all the slides. I had a couple of slides, sorry. I was thinking about network analyses, and let me just say one real quick thing. One of the things that I think is interesting, I'm sorry that's cut off on the side there, but is to think about, this is a network diagram made in Gephi with just a few of the testimonies and keywords from the VHA. But imagine that this was the interface. Imagine instead of going to a search box, you are kind of floating through the graph database, and that this was a way of kind of search and discovery. So essentially, I could zoom into parts, I can click on things, I can look around, and essentially it's, again, a different way. It's not knowing ahead of time what I'm looking for, but it's a kind of browsing-based, as a browsing-based approach to interface design. This, I promise, is the last slide. So what are the future challenges? Well, future challenges here are going to be certainly sharing and releasing metadata, allowing researchers to add to it, adding whether it's new tables or new fields, being able to do things with it, thinking about how to bring data together, designing for multiple front-end interfaces. I think this is really key because interfaces are not static things. Interfaces are design choices, they're epistemologies, they're ways of knowing, and there's a tremendous amount of design, knowledge design that goes into thinking about what they do. They're not abstractions and they're not neutral. And finally, thinking about how to share digital assets, maybe through the model of a GitHub repository. I feel like these are some of the challenges. We know what the anxieties are. We know what the possibilities are. And I feel like it's the folks in this room, who are really pushing forward. So I'm delighted to learn about your work. And I'm going to now, 2 minutes late, turn it over to Alina. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Let's see how maybe the best way to do this. We're going to have 15 to 20 minutes now of comments, questions, discussion on this particular paper. And then, yes, this is how Wolf wanted to do this. It's a little bit different than usual panels. And when we were talking earlier, if we run maybe that at about 15 minutes, we should end up with 10 at the very end to go back and combine the two, if that's appropriate. I also think since you have some slides in there you didn't get to, feel free, if someone asks a question and you think, that was the slide, I jump it over, hop right up and feel free. Lastly, I'm going to, I think, unless I hear differently from Wolf, try to get to you with the microphone. I see that you're filming.
I can help you.
Okay, good. Do you have one that you can carry? Because I'm happy to do so. Would someone like to start us off? If you would also, would you mind introducing yourself just briefly, who you are and what your affiliation is? Yes.
Hi, I'm Paul Jaskett at Duke University. Thanks, Todd. I want to end with the last bit, the visualizers, and the idea of the interface is not being neutral. Unless I'm mistaken, I only know about one visualizer in this room. It does seem that that's a group that we're not really talking to very much. And so what's the, I guess I want to say, why aren't we talking to visualizers? Is that visualization is itself, the way they're conceiving of interface is not yet tied to Holocaust questions? Is it that it is always seen as the end result, so you do your work and then you send it to the visualizers, or why are the visualizers not here?
That's a great question. I don't know for sure that the visualizers aren't here, so we'd have to ask folks. I imagine maybe some are. But I think, there's a model, obviously, that exists in the scholarship that most of us do, which is, we write the darn thing out and we send it away. And again, it's sort of the black box model with regard to a publisher, right? It's like, I don't know nothing about layout, and I know nothing about, how do these galleys get produced? I get them back and I check them, but essentially it's as if the end product, we know that the darn thing should be paginated and bound and turned and so forth. And maybe it's a similar kind of logic that's operating here, which is we haven't given enough thought. Granted, we know it's not going to be a book, but we haven't given enough thought to the way in which the content would be either visualized or made, where an interface would be developed for interacting with it. And I feel like there's a tremendous amount of experimental possibility here. Again, I'm always trying to get away from the search box, because I feel as if rather than knowing, again, what exactly I hope to be able to find, I'm interested in possibilities for discovery and browsability, and that would then require me to think differently about how the data is being interacted with. So I don't consider visualization an endpoint. I mean, I think some of the best work. I think of the Stanford Spatial Lab. I mean, I see Eric here, of course. The work that Richard White and his group has done. It's really it's a way of thinking about research questions from the very start. And it's a mistake to think of visualization as like the last point. You think of visualization as the first point. And you think of interfaces as the first point. And I think that's really still a challenge that we're facing. It's in some ways, I think many of the interfaces I showed you in that first slide are kind of, I'd say they become a little naturalized themselves. We're used to them, and it's the stuff in behind that we need to get to. But in fact, maybe that's prohibiting us from asking some really interesting questions about the stuff that's behind.
The microphone is behind.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I was thinking, since you kind of talked a lot about this binary, about the old and the new and the analog and the digital, I was wondering if this is really such a kind of black and white. Because when you think back, and I think it's more the anxiety is what speaks to the black and white, because the actual, the reality is much more gray. Because as a historian with analog sources, you would do comparison, but it would work in your brain. Right. But what the digital means is actually make it obvious, so that actually others can use it, right, and can do their own comparisons. And I think maybe this is what kind of a democratization process comes out of digitization here, because it allows us to do things we never were able to if we were not specialists, like what the example you mentioned with the death marches and the advance of military operations. They were specialists, they could do this, but now actually everybody could do this.
Right, right. Right. I think that, yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, I wouldn't want to make too much of a black and white binary here. But I think, the approach that one of course can do comparative work using exactly these encyclopedias, and it would involve creating my own notes and cards and so forth. And I think the issue that I think is one that you hone in on that I think is very important is the replicability of my research. So that is could it be reproduced by someone else or checked or extended? So it's like I want to build on research that you've done, but I don't have the same foundation to start with. And so I think one of the possibilities of working in a kind of maybe database-like environment would be precisely to do that, or to enable that. It would be a mistake, certainly, to kind of say it's either this or that. And clearly, I think, one example, I go back to the Holocaust Geographies book, clearly it's almost that the book is a kind of snapshot of a state of knowledge in terms of work that is being presented, as I understand it. And there's much more work that isn't in the book, either because it maybe didn't succeed in quite the way that the group wanted it to succeed, or perhaps it generated different kinds of questions that needed to be, still investigated. So I see the book as really kind of examples of snapshots of state of knowledge and as generating new possibilities through the digital.
Yeah. I believe you were next, sir. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Tim Mackay from the Azrieli Foundation's Holocaust Survivor Memoirs program based out of Toronto. And I just wanted to go back to something you brought up with one of the anxieties that has been brought up, and that was the sense of loss of control. and us working with high school teachers in Canada and trying to present our materials and Holocaust history to high school students. And a lot of the feedback from teachers is the line between the classroom and online and in real life, those lines are blurring. And so a lot of this information is existing in a way that is not bound by, as people who work in these, are specialists in it, all these protocols and stuff. But I really feel that's where this impact can happen, sort of with Holocaust education outside of the alumni, or sort of outside of academia, outside of the classroom. What are some of the ways, because I know the way the Holocaust is presented online, it's a very divisive thing. You look at the rise of sort of the alt-right and how the internet's played into that on 4chan, on Twitter and stuff like that, and the Holocaust and memes and things like that. And us at work, we've been trying to figure out how we are going to do that, knowing that we need to increase our reach, but also wade into these waters that we aren't capable or have the knowledge of the media training to do. Did you have any advice or where you see that going?
Well, I'm hoping some of the presentations tomorrow or today will address this, but it's a very real issue. I don't want to diminish it by saying this anxiety is not rooted in a very strong reality, which is, yes, there's a tremendous amount of trolling, alt-right, neo-Nazi, flat-up, Holocaust deniers that clearly are itching to get their hands into anything. And so, there's the loss of control is also potentially, it does invite a tremendous amount of hatred. And so I think this is really a kind of a larger question for the group to figure out how do we, when we begin to expose the digital material, open up new communities, bring it out, and create, whether it's through folksonomies, through other people, being able to take the material and maybe mix it up. I mean, I saw some amazing work at actually USC where you have folks from media studies who are using the Holocaust testimonies in their classrooms to help students tell their own stories that often have nothing. I mean, they have nothing necessarily to do with the Holocaust, but maybe a story of trauma that they've taken that knowledge, historical knowledge, and applied it to their own life in a very responsible and ethical way. And so, one of the things the Shoah Foundation has done, and I really respect this, is develop protocols for ethical editing. And what does that mean? And I imagine we need to think about protocols for any kind of ethical use of digital artifacts, digital media, digital assets. And clearly there's plenty of ones that would raise huge flags, questions, and would be, downright unethical in my assessment. But I think it's really a larger question for the group, but thank you.
We've had several hands here. We have a woman in the front, and then 2, 3, 4. Would we mind, we have 10 minutes left of question time. Could we get some questions on the table that you could then answer? If we could get this section, and then I'll come to the left, if any of you over there would like to be next.
I'm Ann Knowles. Hello. And Todd, you did not acknowledge a fundamental difference between what the geographies of the Holocaust Collaborative has worked on and everything else you talked about, which is that our work has been collaboration in order to answer particular historical questions. That's what all the chapters in our book about, not to build a shared public digital resource. There is very little analytical digital humanities work going on today, and for the past decade, 15 years or more, it has been focused on building online resources with interfaces. Yes?
Paris Kornakis from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Todd, two very short questions, but I guess the answers will be long. The first, I felt there was this kind of elephant in the room called big data, which you never really mentioned, but it kind of functioned as the foundation of whatever you were talking about. So I was wondering, can there be, if one takes the other extreme, can there ever be, or can there be some sort of a digital microhistory? So can the more ethnographic approaches be combined with a digital take on Holocaust histories? And the second, I think, elephant is not so much quantification, but when it comes to visuals and visualizations, it's positivism and a sense of authenticity, of reconstructing the past, of seeing Auschwitz through the eyes of the inmates, of the prisoners themselves. And yeah, this is a problem. I mean, it goes beyond the quantification, it goes beyond the dehumanization, and brings all sorts of other problems that we thought we have dealt with, right? When we probed the limits of representation 20 or 25 years ago. Thank you.
One more, and then we'll pause for him to answer.
Thank you. My question ties in a little bit to the first question just posed. Should I just speak loudly? Can everyone hear me? Oh, okay, no. Okay, sorry about that. So most of the digital information systems that you were talking on focus very much on the output and the visualization. And my question is, can we also think about it more in terms of that there isn't always extant data, but that through digital information systems we can be looking at collecting data and creating new ways of looking at questions. And so here, again, this is the relation to the ethnography. Can we be thinking of digital information systems as platforms in which data can be gathered in forms of testimony in a completely decentralized manner? And I think I'm thinking particularly of the field in which I work in Cambodia, where one organization is starting to have a platform where testimony can be uploaded by anyone. And there are huge anxieties within that organization in terms of what are people going to say, and can we, and they will not let them be uploaded and presented immediately, they'll be vetted first. But what kind of challenges and opportunities do we maybe have in sort of turning it around and being more input oriented?
Those are all great questions. Let me speak to the positivism question first, because this is, I think when I characterize as empiricism, Paris, I was thinking probably exactly what you were thinking in terms of positivism. You know, this idea of as it really was, right? The kind of this 19th century historicist dream that, of course, has been shown to be bunk, but that we could, you know, really recover it as it actually was. And that's a haunt, you know, I would say. I mean, sometimes I think this is a straw man, but nevertheless, there's a haunt of positivism that probably exists, and I think it's really just confronting that haunt and looking at the contingency of knowledge, which means you expose then the conditions of possibility for how that knowledge was created. So we may create a model that, you know, looks a lot like Auschwitz, but of course it doesn't in so many other ways. And we talk about, you know, all the decisions that were made in creating that model. And I think insofar as you do that, you're looking at process and you're looking at contingency, and it's not about, you know, this idea of reconstituting something in its wholeness. And I think that, again, I mean, I call it the Holocaust Geographies Project because those little methodology sidebars often do exactly that, which is to kind of take it out of the black box and show sort of how it worked. With regard to collecting, I think this is a really exciting possibility, not only for other, you know, genocides, but also it's work that the Shoah Foundation has begun thinking about too, which is, you know, who can participate, how do they participate, how do you see the testimonies as, you know, what is the role of families, or second generation or third generation, how are those stories passed down, what kind of materials may be added to the stories over time, so rather than seeing them as fixed objects, like the testimonies, like, as if they're done, become really more organic and living stories, and invite participation. And that may be, you know, additional stories, it may be photographs, it may be memoirs, scrapbooks. But how to vet that, of course, is of course the question, right? And how to then think about ways of participating is a huge and interesting question about input. With regard to, you know, Anne's clarification, I just say thank you. You're exactly right. I think the ambition of the Geographies of the Holocaust was not to create a shared public resource, although I imagine some of the resources you did create in terms of answering questions would be greatly useful for those of us, you know, continuing to work on the field. And so it was more of an expression of my admiration of that work and the kind of questions that you could begin to answer by thinking of digital methods, whether it's historical GIS and visualization. I think that's That's basically it. Yeah, the microhistories question, I mean, I look at your work, Paris, because I think it's an emblematic example of what a microhistory could do. And so particularly looking at Greek testimonies and Sephardic testimonies and not looking at data in a kind of big sense, but really, this is why I'm thinking scale here is not only the macro scale of the all, but it's the possibility of either telling or thinking through, these what you call microhistories. And I think that's, what exactly that looks like in a digital environment. I would love to, continue to see that. I think that's exactly right.
Thank you, Todd. We have time for one more question, and I'll see if anyone on this side of the room has one, or also open it to a graduate student. No here? Graduate students? No? Does anyone have a final, or we'll continue to move forward, and you can hold them to the Q&A towards the end? Thank you. Thank you very much. Give us. Our next paper is Limits of Representation, Ethics of Digital Shoah History. Our presenter is Dr. Alina Bothe. Alina studied history, politics, and Eastern European history at Freie University, Berlin. From 20 to 2015, she was a research fellow at the Center for Jewish Studies, Berlin-Brandenburg. She wrote her PhD thesis about the digital turn in Shoah memory, focusing on the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive. Her research fields, among others, include digital humanities, gender studies, Shoah history, and conceptual history. She has published volumes on testimony, gender and digital media, and edited a special issue of the Leo Beck yearbook about a conceptual history of the term survivor. Her postdoc research deals with the deportation of Polish Jews from the German Reich between October 1938 and September 1939. She's currently curating an exhibition about the expulsion from Berlin in October 1938. The exhibition will be opened in June 2018 at the Centrum Judaicum in Berlin. For part of this project, she received the USC Shoah Foundation's International Teaching Fellowship, and her PhD is to be published at the beginning of 2018, if I understand. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bothe.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and first of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to be here and to present part of my work. I'm very, very glad that the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, in connection with the UC Shoah Foundation, as one of the absolute major players in this field, have taken up on the topic of the digital approaches to genocide studies for this conference. I will come up in my paper with I'll be dealing with some of the anxieties that Todd already mentioned, and I will explore and acknowledge them a bit further, but my focus here will be mostly on representation. To give a warning first, fair warning, this is a completely non-digital presentation. So there's no slideshow gonna be, it's just me talking. We do not only need to study the vast number of phenomena we encounter in the digital, but we have to aim for a concise approach to the term digital in the title of this conference. Also, given the tremendous work that has already been done, and I'm really excited to learn more over the course of the next 2 days, we have to acknowledge that on the practical as well as the theoretical level, parts of the digital are still widely unmapped. One could even go as far as call it a terra incognita, for which, as Rachel Baum has pointed out quite often, we still need a decent vocabulary to describe. It is also ever-changing, a web in progress, which allows for new ideas and developments every so often. It is necessary to consider special ethics that might apply to this sphere when discussing Shoah history. Digital media is public, powerful, and political. It is a place for discourse where a new act of enunciation takes place, where manipulation is driven by technical possibilities. It is quite lacking rules and boundaries. And in a broader perspective, digital humanities have to weigh into the discussions on democracy and the digital, as well as on the highly difficult fields of truth, stable narrations, and shared reality. Within this context, our own approach to the ethics in the field should be cohesive. In August 2009, Piotr Broszek started a Facebook profile as Henio Żytomierski, a 9-year-old boy from Lublin who was murdered in Majdanek. You will all remember the public debate and often outcry of to this form of Holocaust narrative. In a 2010 clip, the Australian artist Jane Corman showed her father, the Auschwitz survivor Adolik Kohn, dancing in Auschwitz with his grandchildren to Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive. These two examples can be sorted into a growing list of debates about the limits of representation. Other examples include Art Spiegelman's Mouse, and you'll be well aware of the massive critique towards Schindler's List. One can discuss a genealogy of media and critique here easily. The pattern seems to be quite the same. Somehow a representation transgressing borders of appropriateness receives maximum attention in the international attention economy, and then a short period discourse on the pros and cons develops. And normally within a couple of years, this representation belongs to the standard of representations. But it would be wrong to simply assume equal conditions for all four examples I just mentioned. The last two were analog, the first two digital. And we have not yet reached a point where the ethics of representation of the Shoah in the digital have been thoroughly explored, but thankfully we do have a few starting points as Todd's 2016 book. Todd mentioned already a broad array of representations of Shoah history online, and I might add not only the databases but the online exhibitions, the educational outreach programs, the unique phenomena we encounter, games, and very different projects by individuals, as well as a huge range of research opportunities. Historical representations of the Shoah are always negotiated regarding their appropriateness, but also considering the boundaries of showing the unimaginable. Saul Friedlander famously discussed the limits of representation, as we just heard in our first discussion, in his 1992 volume Probing the Limits of Representation, one of the most productive outcomes of the controversy around the postmodern theories of Hayden White. Friedlander wrote in his introduction, and I quote, "The extermination of the Jews of Europe is as accessible to both representation and interpretation as any other historical event," quote, and therefore artistic or scholarly representations are not limited. Nonetheless, Friedlander saw the need to follow with a limitation, which leads us to the core of the events of the Shoah. And he said, but we are dealing with an event which tests our traditional and representational categories and event at the limits. And because of the unique structure of the Shoah as an event at the limits, it does call for boundaries. Because being an event at the limits, it is limited twice, as Friedlander wrote, by a need for truth and the problems raised by the opaqueness of the events and the opaqueness of language as such. Truth here is given in quotes. Nevertheless, Friedlander argues for the stable core of a historical narrative of the Shoah. This narrative is nevertheless hindered by the historical events themselves. Friedlander's discussion of these limits are inspirational for the digital era as well, a time where truth and reality, as well as history, all seen in quotes here, are challenged immensely. We can observe within the last 2 decades the emergence of digital narratives of the Shoah, and we can imagine further forms of digital narratives that might emerge within the next years. What I'm interested for in this presentation are the ethics of representations on two levels, A, framing, and B, narrative. I'm going to discuss both. Both levels are important, and my presentation here is based on observations and analyses I've done in the field of representations offered by key institutions like Yad Vashem, the USHMM, the Anne Frank House, or the Shoah Foundation. And I focused not only on their websites, but on every other way they use the digital media. Today I will generalize from this material and present my observations regarding the limits of representation. I'll discuss some best practice cases, how to handle the ethical challenges we encounter at the end. Digital narratives have a few specific characteristics to consider. The temporal structure tends to be actuality or currentness. Meanwhile, different techniques are used to provide a sense of spatial belonging. Within the structure of the digital, space is not the main point of orientation or reference. It always has to be brought into. Interaction and dialogue can be seen in very different forms, first of all leading to collaborative forms of writing, and we have just discussed the question of authorship very briefly, and we should go into that further on. These narratives lead to fragmentarization and may also lead to destabilize what Friedlander called a stable truth. Another characteristic are the layers of communication, and finally, we do have to consider simulation. Narratives about the Shoah in digital media have developed within the last 15 years into a genre of its own. While the first narratives were resembling films still very much, we can now find most narratives following the logics of the digital. Three main patterns are to be mentioned. The first one is presentness or currentness, the temporal as the main temporal mode of the narrative. The second pattern is experience. Visitors, readers, or users shall encounter an experience. And the third one is spacing, especially maps or narrative aimed at one specific space are to be observed. This can be seen as countering the disorientation within the digital. A specific amount of simulation is to be found in most narratives. Let's have a look very shortly at some examples or possibilities of digital Shoah history. The German Yellow Press Bild.de offered a live ticker in 2014 for the 70th anniversary of D-Day. A typical journalistic format nowadays with not completely researched background stories, but information as the editor receives it. This ticker produces an idea of actuality, of being actually there, the events not happening in the past, but unfolding in the present. So the ticker was fed for more than 20 hours and included entries like 10 a.m., the Führer is woken up, or more banalities like a bit more to the south, British troops under the command of Major Pat Porteous can't withstand the ripe strawberries on field. The farmer is protesting. The Germans were here for 4 years and have not eaten a single strawberry. There are a lot of issues with this ticker, but I'm more interested here in the digital narrative that is simulated, as well as the apparent decision not to repeat the same narrative form 7 months later on January 27th. The liberation of Auschwitz as a live ticker would have crossed, in the minds of the editors, the limits of representation. Narratives in the digital do not stand alone, but they are published within an infrastructure. May it be a newspaper, an archive, a blog, a sharing platform, a social media, or infrastructures developed by the distributing institutions themselves. For discussing the ethics of representation within the digital, I strongly argue for analyzing this infrastructure based on the very different framework it provides. Framing, to me, describes the infrastructure of a narrative in the digital. We do know a lot about the framework of a book or a film, and we do think about the framing, but we need to further think about how the digital imprints itself on content. I suggest here to differ between 4 different levels of framing, at least when you look into an old-fashioned computer and not using any form of augmented realities or different or other digital devices. So the first frame to me is the hardware, the screen deciding on depiction and definition, touchable or not, mouse and tap. Further on, I have to mention here the processor, storage, graphics, sounds, etc. The second framework is the system software, the third one, the browser. The fourth framework is then the actual website. The 4 levels of framing are interplaying, and we are normally considering only the last one. And I'll do the same here following. And I'll do so on the example of YouTube. YouTube is basically a platform, as you all know, to share video clips, which encapsulates a cultural as well as a commercial dimension. The searching tool in this massive amount of data is a specific algorithm which produces and organizes results in a hierarchy. This hierarchy frames and shapes the way we perceive content. If one searches unspecifically Holocaust survivors' testimonies, the result is a list of clips tagged accordingly, most often watched by other users. Also, other searches conducted from a specific computer are taken into account by the algorithm. When one looks at the design of YouTube, next to the main result, you'll find a list of further videos, thumbnails that might be of interest. A design that shall help you to click through more than one clip at once. And I'm grateful that you mentioned the relevance of design before. Thumbnails are basically like other hyperlinks in digital narratives, which shall lead to opening a new website. We should also not forget the opportunity to comment a clip on YouTube, which is often done amazingly well and often done in an intense way, which is fascinating to read through when you go beyond Holocaust testimonies, but you also encounter anti-Semitic utterances there. But what I want to say here about the comment is that, of course, if you go through these comments before watching a testimony, it frames the way, or shapes the way that you'll perceive part of this testimony. So if we take a framework as YouTube is offering, which has a lot of Shoah-related content, the first thing to consider is, and here I'll come back to one of the anxieties, that it is mostly uncontrollable for institutions to use it. A major problem from the ethical perspective is as well the hierarchy of results, and results being based on what other users watched most, because it leads to narrowing down the canon of watched testimonies and other materials. Surprisingly, and I can only explain this with the performance of testimony itself, many users watch a testimony completely. Nevertheless, the design does not invite for immersing oneself into one clip, but to switch. To me, it is important when discussing ethical challenges that we do not narrow down an archive as vast as the Visual History Archive and the about 20 or 25,000 further testimonies we can encounter online to just a very few we discuss, but to get into the unknown parts of the archive. The framework holds power. It is not a neutral offer to use. And within the structure of the framework, the distribution, framing, and perception of content is shaped. We are not at any point discussing a perfect or ideal web. So using YouTube is not only inexpensive, a factor important to many institutions, but it has also a huge outreach. Thereby, the USHMM or Yad Vashem can reach out to users who would not get to their website for research and information by providing content also within the problematic framework for example, YouTube. These institutions, as well as many more, are serving the public with information. I would like to move on to the 2 digital narratives which I see in a certain way as best practice cases worth considering here. And the first one is the Anne Frank House exhibition online. The place where the families were hidden has been replicated in a very detailed 3-dimensional animation, which allows for visiting the space on your own and alone. Based on different multimedia objects within the online exhibition, it is possible to gain impressions of life in hiding. These are parts of the diary, but also short films and texts. Besides, the exhibition includes further material. Their topics are the betrayal, the further fate of the hidden families, as well as the publication of the diary. The tone of the exhibition is direct and aimed to a younger audience. Different to the museum, all rooms can be entered and there's furniture reconstructed. No disputable reductions are done, and also no voyeuristic position is taken. Meanwhile, the hideout imagined with furniture and stuff, it does not cross the border towards an too intimate depiction. This leads to an important aspect of digital narratives, telling us about the syncretic mediatic structure, that the narrative is visual as well. The other one I would like to discuss here is Eyewitness, the educational platform of UC Shoah Foundation, first of all aimed at school students. On this platform, they can research more than 1,000 testimonies and cut them into short films. Eyewitness is not within the open web, but one needs to register. The statements of survivors can be taken out of their original context and be formed into new narrations. Regarding digital narrations or storytelling, it is a highly progressive tool or platform. Therefore, discussing limits of representation is here extremely interesting, also considering the framing of Eyewitness as a more closed platform. It does offer a collection of advice materials for educators, explanatory clips, and a documentation on a workshop on ethical editing from 2012, which is highly interesting to me, as it discusses the extraordinary power and responsibility that comes with editing. And I'm hoping we can go into that into the discussion. The information provided does help in figuring out how to process ethical editing for educators. They also show the potentials of digital narratives crossing the limits of representation while editing and commenting a video, thereby changing the infrastructure of its perception and interpretation. Within the educational setting, progress into digital narratives has been made again and again, while being very much aware of the ethical challenges. Both examples discussed offer their own platform and infrastructure, thereby allowing them an ethical framing of their own narrative while realizing the traps of digital Shoah telling. To sum up shortly, and I've seen the sign, we need to make decisions between outreach and distribution as well as non-controllable framings. Framings are to be taken serious, and when we consider using uncontrolled ones, we need strategies how to work with them. The trend to fragmentarize narratives, especially with nonlinearity, is a quite serious threat to what can be called the stable truths. Search algorithms come with their own moral of hierarchy and ranking. They also tend to narrow our choices to what we or our peers might like. We need to discuss anti-Semitic utterances, denial, as well as fake and false information as challenges for the limits of representation. And I'm sure we're going to do that in the following days. Regarding research, I would just like to mention the difficulties of big data, the white elephant in the room, research designs and authorships. So, to me, the real probes of the limits of representation lie aside from the scandalized phenomena of the attention economy that I quoted in the beginning, and within the infrastructure of the digital. We should use the guidance of Friedlander in developing infrastructure as well as narratives under the specific conditions of the digital, but we should not forget the limits of representation are always open to negotiation. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. It's a wealth of information. Who would like to begin? Period of questions or comments? Yes, sir.
So our talk here at University. So in testimonies, you can read a lot and see that victims actually lost their orientation of space and time. So for them, there was no framework as such. So isn't there a deep contradiction between our effort to build frameworks and framing things and the original experience of victims who lost every frame? Thank you.
I would distinguish two different aspects here. First of all, framing in my mind comes more closer to the infrastructure. And the second thing is that what you rely to is what I would call the experience within a narrative. So we seem to repeat patterns of narratives where experience is highly relevant, or to simulate a certain experience. And as I would understand your point here, part of the way of telling in the digital, as it is there potentially in the technical possibilities there, would be telling it in a disorienting way, losing the frameworks of time and space, which is potentially possible, and I wouldn't see how this is ethically challenging. I think that would be an extremely interesting project to do and to consider. What I more or less observe is that we have a trend to use space for orientation in the narratives.
Thank you. Wolf? Do you have here?
Yeah, thank you, Alina. I'm interested in the question of authorship and the digital, and I think what I came across is that we use digital information. Often there is no author, and sometimes there's no timestamp, so you don't actually know who produced it, when was it produced, for what purpose was it produced. So we lack actually the whole context of this. And the same is when we think about collection of digital material. Often we find a website with digitized sources, but there's no context given why these sources were selected and not others, for what purpose they actually are produced. So there are simple things which are lacking, and I'm wondering what is your stand on this, especially about the authorship.
I would say authorship is challenged here in many ways. I've been discussing mostly today materials done by institutions. So at least we have the institutions as a kind of author when no further names are given. But we know about a whole lot of materials, excellent articles, by the way, in Wikipedia, which appear there without authorship. And I'd say one of the challenges is within our work ethics to that. How do we recognize the amount of work someone has given? And how do we appreciate, actually, work that has been done in a culture where authorship is not clearly marked? Nevertheless, once we tend to big data projects and the idea of looking into thousands of testimonies and sharing results, this is only possible when you give up the idea of concrete authorship and start to work within such an infrastructure or such an idea of a project.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, thanks. But it's interesting the way we're talking about representation that is at least, if not transparent, at least indexical to the real, right? The testimony is the survivor's testimony. But of course, there's that other half of representation, which is artistic representation, which is not attempting to actually, it's referencing the real, but it's not attempting to give you an historical understanding. It's trying to say that there are certain things outside of historical understanding that artworks can actually, can represent. And so, and I'm thinking about, for example, the Dutch Memorial Project. There's a really good example of how abstraction really is the mode of representation. It's not about a transparency. So can you talk about that? Are there different ethics for you in terms of representation as an artistic strategy that is trying to get us to engage with issues of genocide and the Holocaust?
My main focus here is representation as a strategy for historical telling. So I'm not really be able to delve into the artistic representations, but I'm gonna give it a try. What I see here, where I come from, is a tradition of naming. And the Dutch example, as Todd has discussed it, with the abstract way of showing those who were murdered, of representing them, of making their data accessible to us, is, I think, one that was challenged because it was going against this culture of naming those who fell victim. So I wouldn't really see a crossing of boundaries, but a crossing of what we have come to agree on as the modes of representation we rely to. Considering other artistic representations as the ones I've discussed in the beginning, and you can, I think, even say this Facebook profile is a kind of artistic representation, as there is a young historian telling the story from the perspective of a young boy, and in a way writing a fictitious account of it. I would say that most people reacted at that point anxiously towards how this is seen by other users. Is it seen as a representation, or is it taken over the individual or the personality of that young boy? And I've been looking into some of the critiques that were offered at that moment in 2009, and they were offered not only out of anxiety, but they were discussing limits then of how arts should represent. But certainly there can't be limits to how arts represent when they are open to negotiation.
Yes. Can you take?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm Johanna Blakely. I'm based at the Annenberg School at the Norman Lear Center. I've been doing research for a couple of years now on recommendation algorithms. And if you take a look at the white papers of the people who are writing these algorithms, you realize right away that their biggest problem is that they're often recommending things that are too similar to the things that people have just seen. So on YouTube, you get bored if you end up clicking on those recommendations when they're just different cuts of the same thing that you just saw, or so similar it's just not interesting. And they want to create programming blocks on YouTube, right? And this is applicable also to Amazon, to Spotify, to Pandora. Their big problem is to recommend to you something that you haven't seen before and you didn't think you would like. This makes people better consumers, right? They consume more videos. So for Netflix to be profitable, they have to nudge people out of the genres they already like to genres they've never heard of before. So I'm wondering, in what way can digital activists, people who want to take the Holocaust deniers and get a Holocaust survivor video in front of them, how do we kind of harness the commercial imperatives of these algorithms to perform good work like that?
That's, I think, a question for all of us to think about, how activism really can work into that. What I've done is reading through a lot of what I'd say is commentary battles you can see on, especially survivors' testimonies on YouTube, where denial takes place, where anti-Semitic utterances are often recorded, and people do respond. And they respond in a very rigorous way. So they, first of all, respond within the mechanisms of the platform. And what you are asking us is to think about subverting these mechanisms and to develop new strategies. And I think this is actually what I call for when I say if we use these not really controllable structures for ourselves, which come out of a culture of economy, but also of cultural aspects, to say which strategies can we apply on a technology level, but also on a level how we use the material. So I think that is really an interesting point, how to subvert the strategies or the technology that is embedded in these platforms.
We're in the last 10 minutes of the Q&A session, which I believe we wanted to be more general. Todd, if you had a comment to make on that, feel free, or if anyone in the audience would like to comment on the discussion so far. New question then? Or if you would like to keep with those?
I think it applies to both. Could you comment on whether you... thanks, Mark. Could you comment on whether you see any implicit ethical problem or explicit ethical problems in the spatial representation? Perhaps
maybe add.
Sorry, to clarify, certainly the work of our collaborative has sometimes been criticized, the maps being criticized as abstract because they are spatial, because they represent a distance from the ground that eradicates victims. That's my starting point, but there may be many other ethical dimensions of spatial representation that we haven't thought of.
Just let me tell you maybe one example from the work we are doing with the exhibition. And within this exhibition, we are telling the stories of about 6 Berlin families and contextualize this with another 20 families. And we do have 3 maps telling a huge part of the story. One map is a Berlin map with a lot of information. Another one is the refugee camp at the Polish border these people were placed on. And a third one is then talking about 38 and later onwards about what happened to these people. So to me, maps are a way of orienting ourselves in a narrative. So I would always use them, and I can't see any problems aside from being abstract. Of course, a map is abstract, first of all, but when we want to explore patterns of movement, for example, not only on the individual level, but on the collective level, we need these maps to show. So from my own experience, I do use maps to clarify actually within the kind of exhibition we are developing.
This is such a complicated question, to be honest, that it would be an injustice to reduce it to a couple of sentences. But it's something that I've struggled with, and I mean, obviously, I think you've raised a lot of these interesting questions already, like the 3D representation of the Anne Frank house and where one can go and what one can do versus the physical space. Both are obviously spaces that are curated, that are embodied, that allow for experience, but they're different. And why they're different and how they function differently, I think, do raise interesting questions about the kind of experiential histories that we want people to have. I wouldn't say that there's particular problems that are specifically ethical that are connected to the spatial. I think any kind of representation raises ethical questions, regardless of what narrative certainly raises ethical questions. I'd say. Any kind of form, art, media, mapping, all raise ethical questions. I mean, the question is there something specifically unique to that media form that raises a special set of ethical questions? And I'm not sure the answer is yes. I'm not also sure it's no. One of the things that, a number of us who've worked in historical GIS have explored over the years are approaches to mapping that are multidimensional, kind of deep mapping or thick mapping, that are participatory, that are open-ended, that bring in many different voices, that are polyphonous, that don't show one form of representation as static, but really a kind of dynamic, open-ended kind of representation, and linking that to ethical questions in terms of opening up participation and also not wanting to reduce the map to a static, object. I don't think that's happening in the kind of work that I've seen here, and even if there is questions of abstraction going on, I don't necessarily know that abstraction is necessarily unethical. So I think this is a really important question, Anne, but I'm not prepared to answer very succinctly.
Yes, this will be the last question for this morning. Apologies.
I have a cold. I might actually need the microphone. I'm Annika Walke from Washington University in St. Louis. I would like you two to think a little bit about the digital and the virtual and their relationship, the relationship between the two of them. And in particular, I was thinking about that, Alina, when you brought up the Facebook project of a profile created kind of with the name of a Holocaust victim, and you presented it as an art project. But Facebook actually purports to reflect reality. Right? It actually asks people to use their real names, to the point that transgender people, for instance, are not allowed to use the name that they chose. So could you also think about it as an impersonation, actually, rather than an art project, right? To pretend to be a person and to pretend to have certain experiences. Because I think that that's one thing where our interest as historians, which I am and which I'm not, is to understand historical experience rather than make it up based on the data that we have collected and our ideas about the experiences. And a similar question was raised for me in Todd's mention of speculative or experimental analysis, to ask questions, what if? Right? Because they kind of try to create experience realities that didn't exist potentially. So to what extent is, excuse me, is our position, is our perception and interpretation of history more guiding some of these digital or virtual projects than what a historian would want to find out?
Okay, I'm going to try to answer that. Impersonation is, I think, one of the anxieties that were raised very soon in the critique. And to me, it points out to more the fact that we can simulate a certain narrative or a certain position, as they did simulate the life ticker of D-Day. That was problematic in another way because there's no personal perspective coming into it. What we've seen with this Facebook profile is someone taken over the individual position of a murdered child, which gives it a certain ethical realm to think in and to act in. So I would say what is challenging us here is the possibility of simulation.
Yeah. The questions of the counterfactual or the what if are really interesting questions that certainly historians do engage with. To be sure, one of the issues that one of the issues that I think has been interesting in testimony studies lately has been also looking at those dimensions of narrative and storytelling that are other dimensions besides what happened. Things like what could have been, what might have been, the subjunctive or the speculative or the imaginary or the dream, because trauma, as trauma studies shows, isn't something that's linear, and it's also something that can't be reduced to, this happened then this happened and I got over it. It's something that is much more complicated and requires much more complicated narrative tools and interpretive tools to understand. So, for me, the speculative kind of speaks to the complexity of narrative and storytelling and raises some really interesting questions about how we think beyond just what is on the kind of manifest side and really thinking about, I guess, latencies. So that allows us to move beyond this is what happened, but these are a whole range of other possibilities that even in telling about an instance always were there. So how do we make sense of those or preserve those? So that's what the what if means for me. It's not just like what would have happened if X happened, but all those open field of possibilities in the form of the narrative, especially in the form of testimony, and how do we value those? So.
Well, first, thank you to this audience. What a wonderful group of questions to theme out these 2 days. Will you join me in thanking our panelists for the first panel?